my name is Katja. I'm from the University of Ulm, and I'm presenting our paper on game balancing in a bit of a different setting around the tabletop, in the sense that we have an augmented reality table soccer or table football or foosball, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so game balancing is quite commonly used in a lot of games because we want to have players playing at a challenge level that roughly matches their skill set. And there's quite a few ways to do this. There's a lot of things in matchmaking where we make sure that players play against players of like roughly equal skill, or we can use adaptive difficulty levels. And the theory behind it is that when we have matching challenge and skill levels, or like roughly matching, then there is increasing control and immersion, there's less frustration, and all this is linked to player enjoyment, which is generally something that we want. So now the setting here is co-located gameplay in augmented reality tabletop games, and this is a particularly interesting setting for game balancing because these are often very public and social settings in which these games take place, and in such a setting there are very often unmatched games because people can just come up to any social setting and they might not be at the same skill level. And another thing that's very interesting about this setting is that so game balancing can also come with some negative side effects. If it's too obvious, then players can feel that their achievements lose meaning. And if you do this in a tabletop setting, it kind of is very hard to hide the game balancing because it's inherently physical and you can't really hide what you're doing. Right, and so we do want to have game balancing. We're going to have to do it overtly in the setting. And this might be a negative thing, although in social settings, game balancing is often even socially self-enforced by players onto themselves, especially when there are age differences involved. And we thought that maybe we can do this in a way by doing it overtly, balancing it very obviously, but giving players control over it in order to soften the blow, so to speak. And there are results by other researchers, such as Altimira et al., who have explored game balancing in AR tabletop games in table tennis, and their results have shown users expressing the desire for control over game balancing adjustments. So that's what we were wanting to build on. So our main research questions were whether we can do game balancing in this setting and compare the effects on player experience, whether or not the game balancing is triggered by the game system, or whether the players themselves have control over the game balancing. And as a further follow-up question, does it make a difference if this triggering by the player requires game-related skills, or if you can just really easily activate it without any skill involved? So this is a sketch of KickAR, our table football. It's just a regular football table that we then built on and built around. So we have infrared sensors embedded in the table. We can use that to detect the goals, and not just that they occurred at all, but also where in the goal the ball actually went in, so like left or right half, for instance. We embedded buttons in every side of every corner of the table for game balancing purposes, which I'll explain in a second. And we added a camera, projector, and loudspeaker systems above the whole thing, so that we can, in the end, track the ball wherever it's going. We can detect any goals that are happening, and we can project the goal shot onto the table. We can add sound effects for game events. We project the score onto the table, and we also project icons for game balancing, which I'll get to in a second. This is what it looks like when people are playing. Someone has just shot a goal, and so the track is visualized, and the score is going to be increased in a second. So the type of game balancing that we used in our system was boosts and handicaps, and that we were trying to give a hand to the weaker players and give handicaps to the stronger players to even out the playing field. To detect the skill mismatch, so that we know we actually need game balancing at all, we mostly focused on goal difference, but we also included other factors, although to a lesser degree. And the factors that we included were ball possession, so how often each player had control over the ball as they were playing. The average velocity of goal shots, because that's also something weaker players can't quite do as fast as more experienced players. And how often players even use a specific move that is also more used by more experienced players, and how much the system has previously helped them. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because you can find more on that in the paper, but once we have detected the skill mismatch and it's been given an imbalanced score, We then map that to how much we want to interfere in this game, which we range from not at all, we're going to let them play as it is, to mild interference, moderate, high, and maximum, and then we choose from among those game balancing mechanisms accordingly. So down here you can see an image of a game balancing icon as it is projected onto the table. In this case, if it is activated, then the stronger player will have one of their points taken away. So this is one of the more stringent measures, it's not one of the mild ones. Above you can see several of our mechanisms overall, and I'll go through them and explain them here. So we distinguish between two types of game balancing. We have challenges and immediate balancing. Taking away points and adding points are icons that we call immediate balancing. But then we also have challenges in which when they're activated, they have a time span. So you can see the small blue blob with like 10, 20, or 30 seconds attached to it. And so for then, if those are activated, then for the next 10 to 30 seconds, for instance, the next point will count twice for the weaker player, or for instance, maybe the stronger player has like the goal is like shrunk, so they can only use half of the goal. And if they score on the other half of the goal, the point doesn't count, and you get like a nice sound effect like doo-doo-doo-doo. Doesn't work. So these are the game balancing icons that we used. But our research question was mainly about the game balancing variants, right? So how do we trigger these game balancing variants? We compared the system triggered version, where the game would detect the mismatch and immediately activate the challenge or the immediate balancing. In the case of the immediate balancing, the points would then immediately be taken away or added, but if it was a challenge, then the player still had to meet the requirement for it to actually interfere in the actual game. And then we had two versions of player-triggered game balancing. So down here you can see the ball-triggered player game balancing. So we projected the icon onto the table, randomly placed, or mostly randomly placed, but placed that wouldn't actually like have occlusion effects with the bars and the player figurines. And if the player rolled the ball over this icon, it was activated and applied. The button-triggered version, the player just had to slam down on the button that was embedded on the table, and the game balancing was applied in that case. So we have one version that requires some control, or at least a semblance of control over the ball, whereas anyone can slam down on a button. It's also really fun and can activate it that way. So we ran a study where we compared all of our game balancing variants. So we had the 3 game balancing variants I just talked about, and we also had a baseline version, which did not have any game balancing, but still had the sound effects and all the visualization of the shot and the scores. And recruited 24 people in pairs, so 12 dyads, and made them play all 4 versions and asked them a whole lot of questions. So as dependent variables, we measured their affective state and their game engagement, social presence, and various measures of the intrinsic motivations inventory, such as interest and enjoyment, pressure, tension, perceived choice, and competence. We also asked them if they perceived the game experience as fun, fair, and exciting. We asked them to rank the various game balancing variants by their preference, and we asked them whether they would want individual icons to be included in this game balancing variant after they played each variant. The game system also logged various scores on the actual gameplay, such as how the difference was in the end score, which we call the match delta, and also how many of the goals that were scored were actually due to game balancing, because that game balancing was actually a fairly subtle effect in that it actually only ended up being, I think, about on average 1 point something goals in difference that were actually applied in the end. So I'm going to jump right into the results. The effect of game balancing showed that the game balancing delta, so the number of scores that were actually applied by the game balancing, had significant negative correlation with players' dominance, interest, enjoyment, and perceived competence, which confirms prior results that game balancing can have negative effects on player experience. But overall, players very much enjoyed all of it. The most popular variant was the button-triggered version, which from the comments that we got in the open-ended comments, it was most attributed to the physicality of just slamming down on a button. It's very conscious and active. But we also found very interesting things about the player approval of individual icons. So here in this graph, you can see whether or not players would want the individual icons to be included in that game balancing variant. The color indicates which condition it's in, so orange is the system-triggered version, yellow is the ball-triggered version, and blue is the button-triggered version. And you can see here they're split up into challenges and immediate balancing and boosts and handicaps. And you can see here that the challenges were clearly much preferred to the immediate balancing. And they got way better scores overall. They always wanted to have those included, but not the handicaps. But also you can see that in the immediate balancing, if it was the ball-triggered version, players approved of it much more so than the other two variants. So and the open-ended comments gave us some insight into why this effect occurred. And it mostly appeared that players felt that with the ball-triggered version, they actually had to earn the goals that they got, whereas in the button-triggered version, you just slam on the button and you get it as a gift. And they preferred having to earn these points. And one person even directly said ball-triggered feels better because skill is involved. Okay, so the first thing that we want to have, one of our main key findings is we should probably be framing game balancing as a challenge in these games because people want to earn it. And we do acknowledge that there's quite a bit of uncertainty over it. Like if you're not a very good player, then the ball might go running off somewhere and you accidentally hit one of these icons. And of course, then after it's a challenge, there's a certain uncertainty about whether or not you're going to manage it. So if you are, like, if it's a challenge and a boost, and it might be that if you then your next score might count double, you still have to score a goal to get the 2 points, which in prior work has been shown to be a motivating factor as well, like that just the suspense factor. Another thing that I would like to point out is that fairness values in our results significantly predicted the game balancing variant, and it was highest for the baseline. So there was a perceived difference in how fair this was. People felt it was more fair to not have game balancing, although the significant difference in the post-hoc test was like barely reached. It was close to the critical difference. But there really wasn't any difference in terms of player experience overall. So no difference in effective state, no difference in social presence or in game engagement. So even though that they did see a difference in fairness, they didn't really feel a difference in the player experience. It didn't really affect them that much. So this may point to an indication that potentially fairness actually doesn't really matter that much in this context. Maybe they just, or maybe it's just that much fun. But it may not be something that we need to design for as much as we had thought actually prior to this. And the other thing that I want to tell you about is the appearance of the game balancing. So the number of icons that were displayed on the table, because the system detected a mismatch, had a significant negative correlation with perceived competence. And this was regardless of whether or not the system actually interfered with the game and caused any kind of score difference. So even just showing the icons made players feel less competent. So we really need to be very aware of how often we use this kind of game balancing, even in these public settings, or particular maybe, just like in other games. So those are our main takeaways. Players preferred, we can use game balancing overtly in this kind of setting, but players prefer skill-based control over the game balancing. And they would like game balancing to be framed more as challenges rather than immediately applying that kind of game balancing. Also, we have indications that perceived fairness may not actually impact player experience that much in this context. And also, we do need to pay very close attention to how much we use this game balancing in this setting, because even the appearance of game balancing can already affect the perceived competence of the players. All right, I do encourage you all to watch the video. I don't know how much time we have, but I do have it on my laptop otherwise, and we can watch it later, or just come up to me afterwards if you want to see it.
You could actually, how many minutes do you have?
I think it's about 3 minutes.
Okay, then show it.
Show it, okay.
If you can stop quickly.
KickAR comprises of the physical table, which is enhanced for augmented gaming, and as a third component, game balancing functionality. We use the camera for the object tracking and the beamer for our visualization. Infrared sensors detect goals automatically, and LED strips put emphasis on these. Buttons at the side of the pitch are used for one of the 3 modes of game balancing. Additionally, audio lets the player use even more in the game. Game balancing allows for compensating differences between the abilities of players. This compensation is achieved by different means, such as blocking half of a goal. We implemented 3 modes of game balancing: system, ball and button triggered. Firstly, the system triggered mode. The system autonomously detects differences and appropriate countermeasures, such as counting goals double. The mode ball triggered forces the player to actively trigger a countermeasure by rolling over an icon symbolizing it. This icon is randomly positioned somewhere on the pitch. In the third mode, button triggered, the icons are displayed in the middle of the field. One of 4 physical buttons has to be pressed to activate the countermeasure.
Okay, that gives you a rough idea of how the whole thing works. If you have any questions, I'll be quite happy to answer them.
Yes, we do have time for questions. Yes.
Hi, so that's awesome. Really love it. I was wondering, on the button triggered mode, do you have any data on when players actually used it, and did that kind of like align with your kind of design of when handicaps might need to be activated?
So players were quite engaged in using the button, for sure. We did notice that players tended to use the button regardless of whether they were the stronger or the weaker player. So the stronger players even would press the button even though it was actively hurting them. So they were partially self-enforcing handicaps on themselves, sometimes on purpose, but also sometimes I do think just because it was fun to slam the button, or they would just do like not thinking about it, just like they see an icon and they slam it down. We did have, like, you can not see it in these images, but the circles around the icon actually indicated which player it was in favor of. So you could just like look for that color and just be like, if that's my color, yes, I slam it, and if not, you don't. Whether or not they actually went that far and thought about it or just slammed the button, it's kind of hard to tell in retrospect. Might be interesting to look at though, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey,
Hey.
I'm Max from Maximilian Brehm from HBI, so Bremen Institute. Just to be sure, two questions I had. So, 2 small questions I had. You said that the game balancing mechanisms, the effect of the game balancing mechanisms on the goal or the delta goal was only 1.5 around.
In the final score difference, yes. The game balancing icons were displayed much more often, but the final difference in gameplay was on average like somewhere between 1 and 2. I think it was like 1.7 or something.
And you said that the game balancing mechanisms had a negative effect on the user satisfaction?
No, so the game balancing, wait, I can go back to the slide. You mean this one? The game balancing delta. So this is the how many goals were actually scored due to this. So if it was if there was a lot of them that were issued, then it had a negative correlation with players' dominance, interest, enjoyment, and perceived competence. Yeah. So yes, this is a fairly small number, and then the interest,
Okay.
enjoyment, kind of thing.
So if again, if there was a balancing effect, that had a positive effect on enjoyment.
So if there was balancing involved, so if there were goals that were induced by the game balancing, so points that were given through the immediate balancing or through the challenges, either one, then the more there were, the lower the player's scores for dominance, interest, enjoyment, and perceived competence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Ansgar Denning, University of Saskatchewan. You say here that this is coherent with previous literature confirming the downsides of overt assistance.
Yeah.
There's also literature confirming the upsides of overt assistance, so in digital games, however.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the heterogeneity in results here?
Well, I do think that it has upsides and downsides of both digital and non-digital. I think it's very much dependent on the players. So we have some negative side effects of game balancing here, but we also had a lot of upsides. So the players really enjoyed all of the versions, regardless of whether or not there was game balancing involved. And you have to notice that even though players' dominance, interest, enjoyment, and perceived competence was down for this, overall they went out of there with no significant differences between the variants, including the baseline, right? So we did add a subtle form of game balancing, and there was a small it wasn't a huge effect, but there was a small correlation between small negative correlation here, but overall it did work, right? We added the game balancing, and they enjoyed it for sure. So I would say I'm not trying to say that game balancing is a bad thing. I'm just saying that we should be careful with it and apply it more in the framing sense, because that's what they appear to like, the challenging. Yeah.
Thank you very much.